What is grit? And is grit something that you can develop, or do you have to be born with it? Well, my guest today, Lara Jones, is going to give you a framework on how to actually develop grit almost like you were working out a muscle. She has been through some incredibly hard, traumatic experiences, and that's how she's developed grit. And that's how she created these frameworks. And she's going to talk about some of those traumatic events. And I'll tell you, some of them are not fun to listen to, but it's part of her story, and it really shows who she is and what she has overcome to become the woman she is today. This one's a strong message and a very important one for anyone out there who is stuck or feeling like they just don't have the gear to go to the next level. She's going to teach you how to do that. Enjoy. Lara is the renowned global grit expert. Lara has channeled her deep expertise and research into creating the Global Grit system, and that's actually an acronym. And this innovative and tailored framework identifies the 4 pillars and types of grit, accompanied by a bespoke adoption process that transforms theory into action. And she's going to give you actionable insights today. Serving a diverse clientele from Fortune 100 and 500 companies, mid-sized businesses, and elite executives to military personnel and even celebrities, she guides them in both identifying their grit strengths through her customized grit type indicator and honing their abilities across all dimensions of grit to achieve peak performance and unparalleled excellence. We have a lot to talk about today. So, Lara, welcome to the ThriveMore podcast.
Thank you so much, Roger. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for sharing your audience with me today.
Oh my gosh, for sure. And with that British accent, you can talk as long as you want to. I love it. I love it. Yes.
I always confuse the audience. They always say, "Where is she from?" I don't understand. I thought this was in America. Listen, I like to say I'm American. I just speak funny. Okay.
So. There you go. There you go. I love it. Well, I have read your book. I'm going to, for those of you listening or watching on YouTube, holding it up to the screen now, Hunt or Be Hunted. And it's how anyone can develop grit and lead like a legend. And you've heard me on this podcast talk about, never, ever, 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 ever giving up, to paraphrase Winston Churchill, which actually Lara speaks to in her book. And so this podcast is going to be really important for people who are at a crossroads in their life. And she is going to speak, because she speaks very openly about it in her book, around how to maybe take some of the challenges in your life and turn that into powerful change. So just to jump right in, you're kind of known as the global grit girl, you're self-proclaimed, and you have a pretty interesting story. It's a very open tale that you tell in your book. Can we kind of start there and really started in your 20s and speak to that, please?
Absolutely, Roger. Well, I didn't want to become the expert in grit. I know that I am known as a grit development expert, but I really didn't want to be the expert in grit, but I kind of had to, with everything that I'd gone through. And so one of the biggest things that I see is that a lot of people will talk about grit, but they don't necessarily talk about how you develop it, because people think that you either have it or you don't. Well, this is where I discovered that's not true. That's actually a myth, because we all have it. We just have different levels of it, right? And so I have identified the 4 elements of grit and the 4 types of grit, which I will get into. But I'll just start from the beginning and explain to the audience why I became the expert in grit and how this whole grit system even came about. So from a very young age, I've gone through some very, very challenging times in my life. It started as young as as a teenager growing up over in England. I went through some horrific situations over there. And again, you can read about this in chapter 2 of the book, Hunt or Be Hunted. Went through some very horrific situations as a teenager. Fast forward a few years into my 20s, there was a period of time when I was actually banished from my family just with some decisions that I had made that, quite frankly, I didn't see anything wrong with those decisions at that time. Could I have gone about it a different way? Yes, probably. But at that time, that's what I saw that was the right thing to do. I'll fast forward another few years later. I then found myself having to divorce an ex-husband of mine who was U.S. military. And it was a very tragic time in my life, because 4 days prior, I had just found out that the one person that hadn't banished me from the family, which was my grandmother, had unfortunately passed away. And I was there when she died. And then 4 days after that, I found out that my ex-husband, there was certain things that had taken place that I couldn't I couldn't deal with anymore, right? There was a big trust barrier that had been broken. Again, I'm kind of being a little vague here because I don't want to get into too many rabbit holes, to be honest, Roger. So there's, everyone can read about this in chapter 2 of my book. Anyway, fast forward on from there. At the age, in my early 30s, I went through some more horrific situations where, and I really haven't been too descriptive about what I have been through in the past, but some major traumas. But fast forward now to my early 30s. Unfortunately, I found myself in a very abusive relationship and I was beaten severely. And it was really that episode that made me realize, oh my gosh, where is my life actually going? And I was a very successful businesswoman over in the UK. I actually helped build companies from the ground up. And I, had built them into multi-million-dollar empires. I've been very impactful with training teams, with building teams, with teaching them, in how to approach business, in how to have that entrepreneurship mindset, even in the corporate world. And so even though I was successful in the business world, for some reason, grit just kept finding me in my personal life. And so after that episode, I realized I needed to make some major changes in my life. And it took 2 years past that event to finally realize, you know what, I've had enough of this. I need to choose my own grit. And so I decided to up and leave the UK and I left for America. Now, why would I leave a perfectly great career in the corporate world, doing what I was doing, to up and leave, to become an entrepreneur in a brand new country, I might add, where you might think, well, we speak the same language. There's a cultural difference, okay? There are certain words that you guys say that we say differently, or they have completely different meanings. There's some funny ones around that. But, I up and left and came over to the US. And I deliberately had locked my money away because I wanted to really start again. And during that period of time in my life, I went through some major challenges, including the fact that I couldn't eat for 3 days. Now, I'm sure anyone listening, I know you can't really put your hands up because this is, you're not here present with me, but I want you to just think about a time in your life, or, theoretically put your hand up and say, has there been a time in my life where I've given something up, become an entrepreneur, and now everything seems really too gritty and I don't know what to do, and you kind of freeze, or you have this flight experience where you run back to comfort, right? I think we've all been there, right? Because we have a fear of the unknown, especially when something gritty takes place. Well, I'll tell you this, if I hadn't had pushed through the uncomfortable, if I hadn't done the hard things when it mattered the most, then I wouldn't be sitting here today, because guess what? When I decided to choose that grit, what was I doing? I was giving myself the tools I needed for when grit chose me. And guess what? Grit did choose me again. And unfortunately, grit chose me in a very, very significant way. 2.5 years ago, it was 2021. And unfortunately, my youngest son had passed away. And he died in my arms, actually. And I nearly lost my life the same night. It was the most horrific, most tragic experience I have ever been through. Regardless of all the past traumas, this by far was the most tragic. And I remember very vividly that evening, after I was rushed to hospital, my son had already passed away. I was rushed to hospital, my son was next to me, and I was dying, right? My organs were shutting down one by one by one by one. And I had to say my goodbyes to my husband. My blood pressure had plummeted to 53/37. And all of a sudden there was this massive panic in the room. Doctors and nurses were just like flying around, not sure what's going on. They were screaming emergency blood transfusion. The trouble is they were struggling to get the needle in my veins because they'd collapsed. And so in that moment I knew, because this is how my grandmother passed away, with her blood pressure plummeting. So I knew the next time I looked at that machine, or the next time I heard it beep, I'd be dead. I would have flatlined. In fact, my hearing had already started going, my vision had started going, and my speech had started to slur. And I was in my 30s, right? So I was like, I'm too young. I'm too young to die. I have so much more to give. I also have living children at home. I also, bear in mind, I was also a leader. I was an entrepreneur. I had a company, right? I had a whole team of people that were looking to me. I had to put food on their tables. They had to put food on their kids' tables. I couldn't let them down. So I was like, I'm not going anywhere, right? We talk about fight or flight or freeze. I was fighting, right? I was fighting. And so in that moment, I only had a few seconds, and I'd already said goodbye to my husband, and I had a few seconds to live. And I thought, okay, I'm going to use a technique that I teach so many other people called the 5-4-3-2-1 technique. I don't have time to go into it today. If listeners want to learn more about it, they can reach out to me. But it's an incredible technique that I use, and it's all to do with the senses. And it basically helped slow my heart rate down and slowed my anxiety down. So it gave the nurses and doctors enough time to figure out how to get the 16 gauge needle into my collapsed veins with the blood that saved my life. And I kid you not, in that moment, I said, okay, I have two choices. I can either accept this and die, or accept it and I do something about it in terms of how I think. And even in the midst of severe trauma, severe grief, so there's chaos, right? I mean, you imagine, you picture the scene. There was a crash cart in the room. There were nurses arguing because they couldn't get this needle in. There were doctors just staring at the blood pressure machine, thinking, "What is going on?" And my husband standing there, white as a ghost, and just like, "Oh my gosh, like this is, I'm gonna lose her. I'm gonna lose her." And there's me, who's actually completely calm. And why? Because I knew I couldn't control my body physically, but I could control my mindset. And so as entrepreneurs, as business owners, we always want to have that control, but sometimes we have to learn to let it go and focus on the one thing you can control. And that's what I did. And that method actually helped save my life. And so fast forward 4 months later, to be very transparent, I was in a deep, dark place for 4 months. I mean, I had to face the challenge of either burying or cremating my child. What parent ever wants to face that? Nobody. And even if you've never lost a child, any type of challenge in your life that's severe to you, like, you didn't ask for that, right? You didn't want to be put in that situation. But how do you grit your way through that? So it was 4 months later, and I woke up in Jack's room. That was his name, Jack. I woke up in Jack's room, and I remember it vividly. It was a Monday, and it was in January, and it was 2022 at this point. And I remember walking into the bathroom, and there was a window behind me, and the sun was just streaming in, and it bounced off the mirror and onto my face. And it was like a light bulb just going off. And I said, "You know what, Lara? You got to wake up today. Your son did not. You get to feel the sun on your skin today. Your son does not. It's not about you. It's about others. What are you going to do with all of this pain, with all of this trauma, with all of this grief? How are you going to repurpose it and use it as a fuel to help impact others, to help empower others through their hard times, through their challenges, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's at home, no matter what challenges you face, no matter what changes you face. Maybe you've had a bad quarter. Maybe your business is about to go bust. Maybe you're not sure where your next sale is going to come from. Maybe you just feel like, oh my gosh, this is too hard and this is too much of a grind. What am I going to do?" We're going to think again. Because think back to my situation. I was a leader, a CEO. I had living kids, have a husband, and yet I just buried my child. I actually had him cremated, but I had to face that decision, right? And so what did I do to be able to grit through that situation and still come out the other side? And that's when it dawned on me that I had a system that I didn't even realize that I had, that I was following. And I started to reverse engineer and say, what did I get through in the past? Like, how did I get through that? Now, this was very different because this involved so much more effort because there was heavy emotions involved in this, right? But as human beings, we are emotional beings. In fact, the emotional part of our brain is the oldest part of our brain. By the way, I am educated in psychology, mental health counseling, and neuroscience. So I pull a lot from the cognitive sciences, but it helps understand how this global grit system came to be about. And so I said, okay, well, I'm a natural go-getter, right? There's 4 types of grit, and I'm a natural go-getter on the G in grit. But in that situation, I couldn't pull from that because if I did, I wouldn't be here today. And so I realized that I had to pull from a different type of grit that I didn't even realize I had, but I did. And it was the R in my grit. It was the reframe thinking. And I had to practice that over and over and over. And I had to say, instead of saying, look what happened to me, and the audience can practice this with themselves, no matter what challenge they're facing today, the past week, past month, maybe the past year. Don't say, look what happened to me. Say, look what happened, look what revealed me, right? Or instead of saying, look what was taken from me, look what was given to me, right? So many people get scared Well, they face that fear, and then they don't have the tools to know how to equip them to get out of that fear. Why is that? Because they think they can go straight from fear to growth, and they can't. They just can't. There is a gap between fear and growth that most people miss, and it's called the learning zone. And it's the gap right there that people miss because they have this growing need for instant gratification. When you learn how to get into that learning zone from the fear zone, which the grit system does, and I'll walk you through it in a moment, when you're able to get there, that's when you suddenly can say, oh my gosh, if I can innovate my way out of a challenge, it's not a challenge anymore. It's an opportunity.
Yep.
And that's one of the key significant differences between those that get stuck in fear and those that can pull themselves out of the learning. Now, getting to the learning to the growth is another way, right? Of being able to, you have to learn how to innovate. You have to learn how to view things differently. And once you've mastered that, your growth now becomes your new comfort, and the whole process starts again. But in order to get out of comfort and into fear, you have to utilize the G, right? The G in grit stands for get it done. That's where you've got to take action. You've got to execute. There's a lot of entrepreneurs, a lot of business people, a lot of even members of teams, right? That I see they have the knowledge, but they don't take the action. Why?
Yep.
Because they have a fear, right? Well, we have to learn how to reframe that fear. And that's where the R comes in. You have to learn how to reframe what that fear actually is. Most people, in fact, everybody at some point in their lives is going to say, I've had a fear of the unknown. If you don't put your hand up when I say, do you have a fear of the unknown? You're lying. Because it's human nature. It's human behavior, because our brains are there to protect us. If it doesn't know something, you're going to have a fear. You can feel that feeling, but how you choose to react to it is your choice. So when some people don't put their hands up and they say, well, I don't have a fear of the unknown. No, you actually do, but you've learned how to master, how to control that, right? And so that's like a different realm in itself.
This segment is sponsored by Rockbox Fitness Franchising. Take control of your destiny and join the boutique fitness revolution with Rockbox Fitness. If you're ready to make a real impact in your community and own your own business that empowers people to achieve their best life, then Rockbox is the opportunity you've been looking for. They provide comprehensive support from site selection, upfit, training, and turnkey marketing, so you can open your studio with confidence and a strong recurring revenue member base. Visit rockboxfitness.com and click on franchise opportunities to learn more about this exciting venture in the fast-growing boutique fitness industry. It's time to turn your passion for fitness and for business into a thriving venture. It's almost that for millions of years, our brain has been, it's hardwired to protect us so that we can survive, so that our ancestors could survive. And fear was a gift given to us so that we wouldn't go out of the cave and a saber-toothed tiger would kill us. But yet, there are no saber-toothed tigers really anymore. And it's the fears that we have are usually self-made and not really the obstacles, but our brain can't tell the difference.
Correct.
And I've just seen so many people, relationships, business, anything, I'm going to use the word you used, is they get stuck. They get stuck. And I'm hoping, just what you're sharing today can help somebody who's listening who may be stuck and fear is stopping them, because, we've all heard it. Everything we want and we love and we desire is on the other side of fear. A lot easier said than done. But I would love for you to kind of expand upon that as far as when people do get stuck. You started to talk about reframing. Maybe just go a little deeper on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, okay, so if they have the courage to leave the comfort zone and they get into that fear zone, like I said, they either will have this fight, flight, or freeze. Now, if they have a flight, they're going to run back to comfort because they don't know what to do. And so they seek, what their safety net is. If they freeze, it's because they have a level of grit to them that they want to keep pushing through, but they're freezing because they don't have the tools to know how to get out of that fear. And that's why I focus so much on the development of grit versus just talking about grit in itself. I could talk to you about grit all day long. Talking about the development, I could talk about that for the rest of my life, because it's in that moment, right, when you understand, when you have tools and strategies and the ways to get out of that fear and into that learning zone, That's what's going to make the difference. So when you freeze at something, your anxiety builds and the stress builds, and eventually you're going to either get burnt out or your performance will fall, and then you're going to end up getting fired, right? If you work in the corporate world. And so again, that also brings a level of anxiety, brings a level of fear, and eventually you may also run just straight back to your comfort zone. So what about those that decide to fight, right? Well, as long as you have the tools to get yourself out of that fight and into the learning zone, that's helpful. If you don't have the tools and you don't have the strategies, how on earth are you going to get into that learning zone? And so that's why it's so important as an entrepreneur, even if you're a team member, right, listening to this, and maybe you want to make that step to become an entrepreneur, but you're frightened of, well, I have safety right now. Let me just tell you this. You're not safe in anything that you're doing, right? Because you could get fired, right? How is that safe? When you're an entrepreneur, you are now in control of your destiny. You are in control. You can't fire yourself, right? But every sale you make, every person you impact, everything that you're doing in your business, you're doing it for a reason. And here's the thing, don't make it about you. Make it about others. And don't focus on the money. That's where so many entrepreneurs go wrong. Don't focus on the money. You know what you need to focus on? What the biggest currency is? Relationships. Mm-hmm. You focus on building relationships. I also argue that time is another currency. It is. So I always like to act with urgency. But relationships for me is at the top. Because you can't go and do something on your own and do it well, right? It could take you another 10 years to do that. Actually, I create a lot of posts that you can see on LinkedIn. And in fact, one I shared just recently is I talk about we're in this together. We are, right? Don't be a lone wolf. Be part of a pride, right? I like to refer to the lion and I like to refer to the lioness as the hunter. I mean, my book's called Hunt or Be Hunted, right? And I talk about this extensively in the book. And it's great for anyone that's wanting to break out into that entrepreneur world and become successful at it. You've got to remember that, yes, even though we're not being eaten anymore by saber-toothed tigers, in a way, we're still being hunted by our competition. So every day that you don't take action, every day that you do an inaction is another day that your competition are now hunting you. So you've got to make that decision. Am I the hunter or am I being hunted? And if you're not sure, let me tell you, you're being hunted. Because hunters know their target. Hunters know, listen, I know exactly what my focus is. I know exactly where I'm going, and I'm not going to let anybody to derail me. Now, let me tell you another reason why people get stuck in that fear is because you have what I call the naysayers around you, right? You have the non-believers. This is where you have to evaluate your culture of excellence. You've got to be surrounded by people that are either doing more than you, doing better than you, or that are your cheerleaders. Why? Because when times get rough, and they will, it's called the grit you choose versus the grit you don't, right? Grit is going to come find you. It'll come knocking on your door if it hasn't already, especially as an entrepreneur. But when times get tough, you want to be able to have an incredible network to fall back on for the support. Maybe you have a coach, maybe you have a mentor, right? You want to be able to fall back on them to be able to lift you back up and pick you back up again and get you refocused. I am huge on that. I am huge on my culture of excellence. I evaluate it every single day. And I say, who am I surrounded with? Who brings excellence to the field? Yep. Now, you've read the book, right, Roger? So you know that I talk about this in the book, about excellence. And that's also another way of how we can get out of the fear. Like, we have to reframe it. Now, what's another word that I talk about where I said you have to reframe? It's called discipline, right? As entrepreneurs, we have to have discipline. But that word, oh my gosh, you probably just had shivers come up your back. You're like, oh my gosh, I don't like that word, right? Because we have this negative connotation to it. And guess what? 80% of our thoughts are negative and 90% are repetitive. So every time I'm using that word discipline, now a negative thought's coming into your head. And now you're trying to fight me on it, saying, no, it's not. I can be disciplined. Let's change the word from discipline to excellence, because excellence has a more of a positive connotation to it. So I like to call it a culture of excellence rather than a culture of discipline, even though discipline is a huge portion of that. If you have difficulty with that word, we reframe it. See, I just use the R in grit, right? So we have to reframe how we think about things, how we approach situations to get ourselves out of that fear zone and into the learning. But there's no good just doing that. You have to pull from the I in grit as well. And the I stands for impact others. It also stands as a type for innovator. So you have to innovate your way out of a challenge in order for that challenge to become an opportunity. That's how you get out of the learning zone and into growth. Where the T comes in is it's now your responsibility. You've got to take responsibility. That's what it stands for. Take responsibility. You got to take responsibility. You got to take ownership and apply everything that you've just learned in that whole process and start it again. And your growth now becomes your new comfort zone. And it's your responsibility to impact others. Ask yourself, what's your bigger why? Why are you doing what you do? Because if you don't know that, if you don't understand your own purpose, if you don't understand your own mission, then you can forget about doing anything else. Don't do anything else until you know that. Why? Because when times get tough, that's what you're going to fall back on.
Yeah, you always fall back.
It really is. I mean, when I wake up every day, and sometimes I have off days, and I'm like, I don't really want to do this today. You know, I'm not feeling it today. And then I remember, why am I doing what I'm doing? And I remember back to my son, Jack. I actually wear a pin. For those of you that are watching on YouTube, I don't know if you can see that. There's a little pin of baby feet here. This is my reminder. This is my why. It's my reminder that every day I do what I do, not for me, but for others. Because Jack passed away, because I nearly lost my life, I'm now able to empower and impact thousands and thousands and thousands of people to make better decisions in their life, to even make a decision, to maybe get themselves out of a rut, to get themselves out of that fear zone, to understand that as a leader, you have to lead in times of challenge as well. And this is the thing, and I just want to share this, that, you know, how many of the audience here have been to a leadership conference, or maybe you've been to a leadership program and you felt like it was really great in that moment and then it just fell by the wayside? I bet every single one of you right now is saying, yes, me, right? Well, that's because a lot of people think that leadership is about interpersonal communication and it's about between you and one other person. But leadership is more than just interpersonal communication. It's about getting it done. It's about reframing thinking. It's about impacting others, and it's about taking responsibility. What did I just spell? Grit. So leadership is grit. You can't be a leader without it.
Thank you for all that. Thank you. I have like 3 pages of questions, and you've already answered about 3/4 of those, which is wonderful. Made my job really, really easy, Lara.
Oh, I love that, Roger.
You have written here, be in control of your thoughts and you'll be in control of your life. That's in your book. Speak to that.
That actually is from chapter 7 in my book, and it's all about the reframing how you think. So the reason I came up with that is because when my son passed, I actually remember this so vividly. I'm just going to paint the picture here. I was slumped on a heap in my bathroom floor. Like, again, this is, a few months after Jack had passed away. I was just crying. I was a ball of mess, and I was just crying. And I thought, I am known as a gritty person, but I just don't know if I've got what it takes to get through this, right? I never prepared myself to get through something as horrific as this.
It can't go without saying, losing a child, I'm a parent of 2. There cannot be anything harder than that. Like, I don't care, losing a limb, losing a parent would be terrible, losing a sibling, of course, even a spouse. Losing a child, to me, has to be the worst possible thing that can happen to somebody. And again, you're talking about how to survive that and then thrive beyond that. But let's just call it what it is. It's the worst thing that can happen to somebody.
It really is. I've gone through severe trauma in my life. Let me tell you, I've never lost a limb, but I will tell you that losing a child, it feels like half your body is missing. This is the only way I can describe it. It feels like I do have a limb missing from my body, but nobody else can see it. And so also I have to go through life where people can't see the pain, but I'm living it, right? I'm living it every single day, but they can't see it, right? I mean, in the beginning they could, because I was emotional and, I was crying a lot. But as time goes on, you learn how to control those emotions, but other people then can't see it. Well, this is another thing that people don't talk about when you lose a child. In fact, this isn't just applicable when you've lost a child. This is applicable to anything else in life when you go through a challenge. Have you ever lost somebody and suddenly realized that you faced secondary losses? That's what happened to me. In other words, There were some friends that didn't know what to say, so they said nothing and they walked away. There were
Mm.
others that were very blasé and said, well, you could have another child. I couldn't believe it. I had one person say that to me. I couldn't believe it when they said that to me. I said, well, how many children do you have? And they said 3. I said, well, line them up against a wall and I'll pick the one that you don't want. Because that's basically what you just said to me.
Oh, yeah.
Needless to say, I didn't speak with them again, but it completely blows your mind. And so here I am walking around with this tremendous pain that nobody can see. But bringing you back to that moment when I was slumped in that heap on the bathroom floor, and I have like grey tiles in my bathroom, so trying to picture the scene, and I'm just a ball of mess, and I'm thinking, I just don't know if I really have what it takes to grit through this. Well, it starts with wanting to, number one, and that's difficult because you think, well, how can I want to? Because I don't want to face life without my son. And so what was happening to me was I was actually becoming comfortable in the fear because I didn't want to come out of that fear because I was too scared to smile again. I was too scared to laugh again through the fear that my son would be forgotten or that I didn't care or something. Obviously, I always care, but I didn't want other people to think I didn't care when, of course, I care. And so you start to create this guilt. Now, again, you don't have to have lost a child to be able to have these feelings. It could be anything in your life, any type of challenge, maybe some other type of loss. Maybe you're just having a really bad day that day. Maybe you've had a bad quarter, maybe you've had a bad year, and you think, I got to just give up on this. No, that's where you're wrong. Grit to me, and I've been asked this many times, what does grit really mean to you? And there's people out there that say, grit is about passion and perseverance. And I say this, listen, because I know Angela Duckworth talks about that, about passion and perseverance. And, but if you ask, how do you develop it? She openly has said, I don't know. And then Carol Dweck's come along and said, well, you've got the growth mindset and the fixed mindset. And she said, if you have a growth mindset, you can have grit. But there's a great big gap in between. And I said, well, how do you develop it? And that's where Lara Jones comes in with the Global G.R.I.T system. And I actually have a system for you to develop it because I want everyone to understand that you listening right now, you have a level of grit. Maybe you don't know it. Maybe you haven't tapped into it. Maybe you don't know how to unlock it. But listen, as a baby, you learn how to crawl, you learn how to walk, you learn how to talk. So therefore, you had grit. Because how many times did you fall down as a child? So many you don't even remember. Right? But you had to have grit to be able to learn the language. You had to have grit to be able to get up and walk with your feet. You had to have grit to be able to even use your arms in the first place and your hands and learn how to crawl. You had to do all of that. It requires grit because you had to get it done. Your brain had to tell you how to think about it differently when you were trying to pull yourself up. Oh, I can use this couch to pull myself up rather than falling down all the time, right?
You use that analogy in your book, and it made me smile because I thought, gosh, a baby is the greatest example of just someone who won't give up. They'll
exactly.
just keep, as frustrated as they get, and they cry and they scream, but they don't stop. They keep going,
Yep.
And so it's in all of us. It's in all of us. This segment is sponsored by Beamlight Sauna Franchising. Are you looking to take control of your destiny and own your own business? Do you want a great brand in a rapidly growing market? Well, Beamlight Sauna is a nationwide health and wellness franchise with amazing opportunities in select markets. You can bring the power of infrared sauna and red light therapy to your community while you build a thriving business. Beamlight Sauna offers support that includes site selection, build out, even pre-launch programs and turnkey marketing so you can open your studio with a large recurring revenue member base. To learn more about business ownership and franchise opportunities in the fast-growing health and wellness space, go to beamlightsauna.com. That's BEEM lightsauna.com and click on franchise opportunities to learn more.
It's fascinating because to me, like grit is a muscle, right? And I'm also an executive coach. So I coach a lot of top executives across Fortune 100 and Fortune 500 companies. And it's amazing to me how much some of them don't realize this, but grit is a muscle because they have the belief that you either have it or you don't. And I say, no, that's a myth, right? Grit is a muscle. So you either use it or you lose it. It doesn't mean that it's lost forever. It just means that you've got to tap back into it again. But it starts with the belief, right? But what's before the belief? You have to create an environment that gives that person the autonomy to learn in the way that they want to. So as somebody that has studied extensively in psychology, mental health counseling, and neuroscience, I mentioned earlier, I pulled from those cognitive sciences. I want to make sure I know there's 3 different learning styles. And as entrepreneurs, it's important to understand this. There's 3 different learning styles. There's through vision, there's through listening, and there's practical. So as a keynote speaker traveling across the country with my workshops as well and my programs, and even as a coach, I have to make sure I address all 3 learning styles because everybody's different, right? So you have to understand that creating that environment is what's going to create the belief. When you create the belief, it creates the motivation. When you're motivated to act, right, because you have that belief, that's when you influence how you think. When you influence how you think, you're able to alter your brain processes. Because again, when you use, and the R in Grit, chapter 7, very important chapter, there are some exercises in there that will help you learn how to do this. But when you carry that out, you have a physiological response, and your physiological self is connected to your mindset and connected to your brain. The 2 interlink between each other. And so the more that you practice that, the more that you say it out loud, the more you reframe a situation, the better your brain starts to learn, because your brain can't learn unless you give it information. So we have to learn how to control that fear and put ourselves into that fear in order for the brain to learn. So it's a bit of a catch-22. It's like, well, which one do you do first? And I've got a great example of that because I'm also an athlete. So I give some examples from my athleticism as well in that regard. But without going too far off track, I mentioned, grit is a muscle. So we have to practice it every day. And that's why I'm so big on the grit you choose versus the grit you don't. And if you feel like something's too hard, I want you to remember what I just went through and how I had to grit through cremating my child, coming home every evening, not being able to hold my child and instead hold his urn, while saying goodnight to my living children, and running a business and traveling and speaking to people. And also I'm married. So there's so many different avenues in that listen, if I can do it, so can you. So can you. Yeah. And remember, I did come to this country with nothing as well. So I've built what I've built from nothing while going through trauma. So if someone tells me they don't have it, they don't have what it takes, I will challenge you on that 100%. You got to use the grit.
One of your quotes in here too, because you have this section where Lara actually has myth, and then she debunks it, and then a myth, and then she debunks it. And one of them is that chapter 3 that grit causes burnout.
Oh my gosh!
And you challenge that. And
I love this.
It opened my eyes. It opened my eyes to no, that's not what causes burnout. So speak to that, please.
Yes, absolutely. I absolutely love talking about this. So a lot of people think that grit, they get scared of grit because they think it's a grind and then it will lead to burnout. Grit doesn't lead to burnout. What leads to burnout is grit unchecked. So we have to check our grit using the 5 pillars, right? So let me just tell you that if you have a computer, if you have a phone, if you don't charge it, it's going to die, right? It's going to die. So, but in a few years, if you abuse it, you don't really take care of it, you can just upgrade it. Well, you can't upgrade your body. We only have one body, so we have to take care of it. So from a physical standpoint, grit isn't just about, thinking with your mind, but we have to support our brain, which is an organ, by the way, right? We have to support our software, our brain, with our hardware, because our hardware is what protects the software. So the 5 pillars that you have to follow in order for grit not to become a grind and not lead to burnout is you need to be drinking at least a gallon of water a day. You should be sleeping at least 8 hours a day. You should be eating clean, right? No processed foods. And I'm sure some of you are rolling your eyes at me right now. You're like, oh my gosh, really? I have to do this? Yes, if you want to take care of your body and you want your brain to be working at optimum levels, you also need to be getting some sunlight on your skin every day. It also helps, it's better to do it in the morning because it helps your circadian rhythm, so it's going to help you sleep better. And you also should exercise at least 5 times a week for 30 minutes a day. Now, again, a lot of you probably know this, but you don't do it. Why? Because you don't understand the benefits behind it. Maybe some of you do understand the benefits, but you still don't do it. Why? Maybe because you don't believe it, or maybe because it's just in your eyes easier to do the stuff that you've been doing for so long. Why? Because it's become a habit. So what do we have to do? We have to change those habits. And that's when it becomes tough. That's when you have to pull from your grit to be able to make it work. But guess what? Once you pull from that grit, you get out of your comfort zone and into the fear zone of actually adopting these 5 pillars. and then you realize that you're able to get out of that fear zone and into the learning zone, now your brain is learning and saying, oh, okay. Because I would tell you this, a lot of people say, how do you have so much energy, Lara? How do you have so much energy? Because I'm traveling all the time. I mean, I'm in different state almost every week, every other week, at the minimum. And I'm also an executive coach. I teach programs, right? I've developed programs for companies. I do workshops with teams, right? I coach individuals, entrepreneurs, all of this, right? And I'm traveling so much, yet, and I'm also an author. I wrote a book, and I have little children, and I'm a husband, and I'm an athlete. How do I do it all? My 5 pillars. I kid you not. My 5 pillars. They are so basic, but they are the foundation to what creates the grit that you really need to push you through those hard times. Because my brain now has the protection of what I'm giving it through the 5 pillars to be able to work at its optimum level.
I think you also, though, something in because I remember reading about the 5 pillars, but you also, man, I'm going to misquote you, but something around the lines of, it's when persistence isn't matched with passion that you
Yes.
burn out as well. And I think that's what stuck out to me is, man, if you're not super passionate, then yeah, if you work 12-hour days, it's going to suck and you're going to burn out sooner rather
Yeah.
than later. But when you have passion, it doesn't feel like work.
Yes. And that's actually, I spoke to it earlier, but that's where the why comes in, right? You have to
Yeah.
understand, and it's about the mission and the purpose. You have to understand your own mission and your own purpose. Let me just tell you this. The reason I wake up every day is because I have one mission and one mission only. And that is to impact at least one person for at least one day for every day I'm breathing. I am very clear on that. I know my mission. I know my mission. What is my purpose? My purpose is to empower belief and transform futures. Very simple. It's very simple, but I know that every day. So when I have those tough times, right, when you feel like, oh my gosh, I'm so tired from it. No, you wake up and you realize, this is my purpose. This is my mission. You don't get tired from it because you have such a passion towards it. If you haven't identified that yet, I urge you to really think about what it is that drives you to get you to where you want to be tomorrow. Like, what do you have to do today to get you to where you want to be tomorrow?
Yeah.
I urge you to look at that and say, what is my purpose? What is my mission? What are my values? What am I prepared to sacrifice? And what am I prepared not to sacrifice?
Yeah.
Those are some very important avenues to look at, because if you don't do that, then that very word grit is going to scare you and you're going to remain stuck. And guess what? You will burn out.
Yeah. I'm really glad that you also said that, because I think people need to understand this, especially if they're looking to start a business or they're in business and they're having a tough time. There is nobody on this planet, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, name it, that every day of their life has woken up and said, yep, this is awesome and I can't wait to do it. Like, we all have these days where we say, is this worth it? What in the hell am I doing? But it's then, if you just pause and say, okay, why am I doing this again? Let me remind myself, that's why I'm going to get up and I'm going to go crush today. There's a fallacy that people think, oh, if you've made it, if you've accumulated wealth and you've done, then every day's easy. No, the problems just get more complicated. That's all that happens. The problems get more complicated.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's true. It's true.
Yeah.
And that's also important to remember. Don't make it about you. Make it about others. Remember, I talked about that relationship pillar. You got to focus on relationships. Stop chasing the money. The money will come, but you got to focus on relationships. That is first and foremost the number one, because if you, with what you're doing every day, if you're impacting others, don't make it about you. If you're impacting others, oh my gosh, the passion that you get back from that, the focus that you then have, and you see the transformation in people because of what it is that you're doing and seeing how it's impacting so many, that in itself is a reason to wake up every day and do what you're doing. So remember, it's not about you, it's about others. That's the I am my grit. It's impact others.
Love it. I love it. I always ask my guests the same last 3 questions before we find out, because I definitely want the listeners to be able to connect with you and find you and follow you. But before we do that, I always like to ask the same 3 questions, because it's always interesting to get different perspectives. And the first one is, people know I'm an avid reader. I just love to consume, I loved your book as well. And by the way, when I ask you this question, you can't pick your book. That's cheating. But is there is there a book that you've read, and I know you're very well read, and you cite a lot of, in Lara's book, she cites a lot of different historical figures and quotes them, and it's really kind of neat. But is there a book that you've read? It could be business, it could be self-help, a biography, it could be fiction, nonfiction, that you've read, and when you finished it, you set it down and you said, I will never think about this subject the same way. That was life-changing, life-moving, and I'm going to recommend this to everybody I possibly can. Is there a book that you could share with the listeners that had that impact on you?
Oh my gosh, Roger, that is quite the question. I think there's probably been a few books like that.
Sure.
I think that every time you read a book, you want to take at least one golden nugget from it. There's actually a book I'm reading right now called Play Bigger. And it's very impactful because it really, and actually this is very relevant for your audience. I would suggest that they read it because it helps them, it will help, helps anyone that's reading it to understand that when you're as an entrepreneur, when you're in business, you've got to understand why it is what you're doing, but what is the category that you're in, right? Why are you different from so many other people? What makes you unique versus somebody else? So as an entrepreneur, I really encourage you to figure that out first and foremost, right? Figure out your why, figure out your purpose and your mission, and then say, why am I different? Why am I unique? Like I'm very clear on what I do because I focus, I'm known as a grit development expert. So I'm known as a leadership performance expert, but leadership performance and grit development expert. Very, very important because that word development means everything. It means I don't just talk about grit and saying this is what you have to have in order to do what you need to do. I say this is what you have to have, but here's the tools on how you need to develop it in order to be able to achieve what it is you're going to do. That to me is a whole new category. So when you're an entrepreneur and you are starting out in your business, or maybe you have a business, maybe you're having a tough time right now and you're like, well, why is that? That's when you've got to figure out, well, why am I different? Why am I unique? So I think when you look at branding, you look at marketing, that in itself is very impactful with how you present yourself. And I will really urge people to stay authentic to themselves. Stop trying to be somebody else that you're not, right? Be authentic to yourself because that's what attracts people to you. When you're authentic, you build the trust. And when you build the trust, you build relationships. Yeah. And that's what's going to get you to go further in not just the business world, but in your life as a whole.
Yeah. Thank you.
Welcome.
I'm very enticed to hear your answer to this next question. So let's fast forward to the end of your life. And you're going to live this rich, beautiful life. And you've already, and you're going to continue to impact thousands of people. So we know that. But the day comes for all of us. And let's say we're at the end of your life and we're at your funeral and you're looking down from above or from wherever, and a loved one is there reading your eulogy, and they are only allowed 3 words to choose to that they can choose to describe you. And those 3 descriptors, it doesn't have to be a phrase, but just 3, words. What 3 words, Lara, do you hope that come to their mind to describe the life that you lived?
Never gave up. That's a very
Mic
easy
drop.
one for me. Exactly.
Mic drop.
Mic drop.
I love it.
That's a very easy one for me to answer.
I should have seen that one coming. Yeah. All right. Well, then the last one, this one's just kind of fun, but it's also, I think it's a great exercise just to understand, how you feel and where you're at in today's world. Today's world's kind of crazy. Like the world's kind of crazy today. That kind of it is. And if I were to give you a magic wand and you could wave that magic wand and make one significant change to the world, like just you wave this magic wand tonight, we wake up tomorrow and the world is different one way. When we wake up tomorrow, how would the world be different according to you?
That every single person had a belief that they have grit. 100%. I want to create the largest network of grit activated leaders. I want every single person to understand that they have grit, because when you have that belief that you've got a level of grit, you only need that small snippet of belief to be able to motivate you. I talk about this in the book as a whole process that I've designed and developed all through scientific research. It's in chapter 5 of the book. But if you have that belief, that you can do something and you have that level of grit, you're then motivated to act on it. And that's what influences how you think. And that's what changes your brain process to allow you to have a growth mindset to adopt the very thing that you're trying to do in the first place. So my biggest, if I could wave a magic wand and say that everybody understands they have a belief that they have grit, not just belief in themselves, but belief that they have grit. And no matter what challenges that come their way, even if it's as severe as what I've gone through, or maybe it's something super severe to that person, right? In that moment, no matter what it is, there is always a system, always a way out, right? Of being able, and when I say way out, I'm talking about using grit. I'm talking about either getting it done, putting from the G, either reframing how you think, putting from the R, impacting others with the I, or taking responsibility using the T. There is always a way through. Okay, I unfortunately have seen, I also work with veterans. I sit on the advisory board for a nonprofit called Warrior Rising, and the amount of veterans that end up committing suicide is horrific. There are also parents that have committed suicide from losing children. And oh my gosh, it breaks my heart because the pain is so severe for them. And post-traumatic stress disorder is a real thing. I was diagnosed it with myself. There's traumatic brain injuries that happen with veterans. There is so much that happens to these particular individuals that I want them to know, listen, there is an answer. And it might not even be the answer that you're thinking in that moment. There's something else, and we have to reframe how you think about it. And it absolutely is possible. So I've given you a bit of a long-winded answer here, but I'm very passionate about it. I want everyone to understand there is a way through any situation where you can then live a long and happy life. There is always a way through. And if you don't think there is, please read my book, read chapter 2 of it, and realize, oh my gosh, this woman has been through hell and back, right? I talked about losing my son more so than anything else in this, but trust me, there's been so many other traumas that I've gone through that I'm sure many could even relate to, not just from being beaten up. There's been so much more. Read about it in the book and then realize you can grit through it.
I was reading it and it was like, oh, that's a tough thing. And then like the next page, like, oh man, she's really gone through it. And the next thing is like, oh my God. So it kind of builds. And then obviously the terrible crescendo of it. But again, there's a happy ending of the way that you've turned that pain into progress and turned that pain into helping others. So that's the most important question I can ask you. How can people find you, follow you, be part of your journey?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a few ways. Number one way is to go on LinkedIn, because that's one of my main platforms. So on LinkedIn, just type in Lara Jones and put Grit Global. It's the name of the company, Lara Jones Grit Global, and I'll come up. And you can follow me on LinkedIn and reach out to me there, connect with me. Also on my website, larajones.com. It's very simple. Lara. There is no U. Okay. No U. It is pronounced Lara. LaraJones.com, and you can learn a little bit more about me. I have a calendar on there. You can get onto my schedule if you want to talk a little bit more about, what it is I've spoken about today, or you're interested in any type of, coaching, or you want to get the book or whatever. Obviously, the book is available on Amazon. So if you just go to Amazon, type Hunt or Be Hunted, Lara Jones, the book will come up. But I do have something I do want to give away to your listeners. They, I think, will be a tremendous help to them, especially after hearing today about the grit system. They're like, well, I want to learn a little bit more about this. If you open up your text app on your phones and you just type in the word grit and you text it to 55444, but if you text the word grit to 55444, then you will get access. You'll be able to download my free Global Grit accountability guide. So it basically just gives a very brief overview of the 4 elements of grit, and there's some exercises in there that you can do to help you get better at those particular areas. So I highly recommend you do that. So just text the word grit, G-R-I-T, to 55444, and you will get access to that accountability grit guide. And awesome. Again, if it's something that you want to speak further on, please find me, through LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram and Facebook as well. It's at official Lara Jones. If you want to find me, at official Lara Jones. But otherwise, send me a message on LinkedIn, reach out to me via the website, and you can schedule some time on my calendar.
That sounds great. Well, I just want to say how grateful I am that you came on today, and you speak with such passion and conviction I know that this is going to help somebody. I know that there's somebody that is stuck listening to this right now, and your message and the resources that you offered will help them. So I am very grateful and appreciative of you sharing your story today. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Roger. It's been an absolute pleasure to be on your show today. And thank you again for sharing your incredible audience with me today. So I've definitely hopefully achieved my mission today, right? Impact at least one person.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Me. Absolutely.
There
Yeah.
you go. Yeah.
Check the box. Check the box. Yeah. Great. Thank you for tuning in to the ThriveMore podcast. Don't forget to take a look at the show notes for any of the resources that we mentioned during the podcast. And if you haven't already, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you have access to the latest and the greatest. You can connect with me on any of the socials at Real Roger Martin. And be sure to check out our website, ThriveMoreBrands.com. There you'll find information on the brands we support and information on franchising. Thanks again for tuning in.